Welcome to the West Energy Podcast, powering your career. The energy transition plays a crucial role in Australia and the world's future, and the success of this shift hinges on the people driving it. This podcast will interview a diverse group of energy leaders to provide valuable perspectives on career development, leadership, navigating the energy transition, and discussing strategies to manage mental health and wellness in a high-pressure industry. I'm your host, David Smith, the founding partner and director of West Energy and West Recruitment. With over 20 years of recruitment experience and a team that specialises in recruitment across the whole energy supply chain, we're really excited to bring you this series. So welcome to the West Energy Podcast, powering your career with David Smith. I'm David Smith. Very honoured and glad to have Robert Webster joining us on the podcast today. In the podcast introduction, I mentioned that our main goal on this podcast was to discuss Australia's energy transition, leadership, diversity, and to explore the unique career journeys of our guests. Robert Webster, for those who don't know, you had an incredible background. Not only did you serve as the New South Wales Minister for Energy, you also chaired Endeavour Energy for 8 years. You held board positions with Brickworks, Alliance, Mirvac, Macquarie Generation, and spent over 20 years in executive board search. This year, you were appointed a member of the Order of Australia for significant service to the people in the Parliament of New South Wales and business. Quite a lot of accolades. Bob, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, well, thanks for that wind-up, Dave. But no, it's been a very interesting career. It's I'm now taking it a bit easier in my early 70s, but I have been fortunate to see the transition in the energy sector over a long period of time. Yeah. And it's still transitioning, as we know.
Yeah, we're going to say it's going to be an interesting number of years ahead. So, Bob, for our listeners to get to know you a little bit more and in your own words, who is Robert Webster?
I'm the son of a farmer. Grew up on a farm at a place called Blanket Flat, which is between Biggar and Binder, which no one would know where that was. But it's
near Goulburn?
Near Crookwell, near Goulburn. Okay. Yeah, near Goulburn, near Crookwell. Lovely part of the world. I was an only child. My parents were both in their 40s when they had me, and I was it. So, of course, I wasn't spoilt. But I went away to boarding school quite young, and my father was always keen for me not to be a farmer. He thought it was too tough a game. So when I left school, I started doing law.
Yeah.
And then sadly, my dad had a stroke, which was followed by another stroke and another stroke over a couple of years. So I had to go home because he said, I can't afford to keep you at uni and pay someone to look after the farm. So I went home to look after the farm, always with the intention of going back to law, but that didn't happen. Dad died when I was 22.
Yeah.
So I took over the farm then and I think made a reasonable success of farming.
Yeah.
But I was always interested in politics and the law, but particularly politics. And it was during a very busy time in Australian politics at that stage when Gough Whitlam was elected as Prime Minister after many years of Conservative government. Made a lot of changes, did a lot of things which we thought weren't beneficial to the country and to farming. So there was lots of politics around that. Yeah. I joined the Country Party as it then was, then became the Nationals eventually, and got elected to the local council while I was still farming. And then when the opportunity presented itself, and of course during that time I got married and had 2 kids, at 32, our local member, Ron Brewer, who was a crusty old soldier settler, decided to retire after 19 years, and I ran for pre-selection and won it against his son.
Oh.
Interesting times. Ron was very encouraging of me to begin with, and then all of a sudden the encouragement sort of dropped off because Peter decided to put his hand up. We had a big pre-selection meeting. I beat him by 41 votes to 40.
Oh.
For pre-selection for the seat of Goulburn, and then ran in the state election that followed and won by 1,300 votes. And coincidentally, my campaign director was Duncan Gay, who many years later became Minister for Roads in Barry O'Farrell's government. So that was an interesting time of transition. Kept the farm, had a great manager looking after it for me, and threw myself into politics.
There you go. All right. Well, all different areas I'm very much looking forward to exploring. I've got a few very quick ice-breaking questions for you. And I think you alluded to this earlier. What did you want to be when you were at school?
That was it. So I loved history. I was a good writer, and so I saw myself as a lawyer, and maybe subsequently as a politician. So they were my main interests, and obviously I pursued those. But I enjoyed, I was a rugby player, not very good one, but I played rugby at school, and then second row.
Okay, I was thinking maybe
I was 6'3" in those days. I've shrunk a bit in the last couple of years. And I was also a rower, which I enjoyed. Great sport, and that taught me a lot. Great sport to understand teamwork and working together with people. So absolutely, I did that, and then I played rugby when I went back to the farm for the Crookwell Desperate Dogs.
Okay, well, I would imagine that would be fun rugby
that was a lot of
in
fun.
The country, but maybe a little bit tough. I wouldn't necessarily say tougher, but probably different form of rugby. Second question: who's the most interesting person that you've had dinner with, and why?
I had a few. It was quite an interesting one to think about. Probably Colin Powell, who was at the time, he wasn't the Secretary of State when I met him. He just retired from the US Army. He was the first black man to become a general in the US Army, and became Secretary of State under George W. Bush. But I sat with him at a dinner. He was visiting Sydney, and was after I'd left politics. I was working for the Investment Bankers Industry Association, and the guy who was running Citibank at the time invited me to go to dinner, and I sat next to Colin Powell, and it was fascinating. Very fine guy. And so he became Secretary of State. So he's one, but I've been lucky enough to spend a whole day with who is now King Charles when he was Prince Charles, and that was interesting. I'm a great fan of his. He was it was during the Olympic bid, and we took him on a tour of Homebush Bay and so on. So we spent the day with him, and he was incredibly well briefed, very interesting and interested in everything. So I'm sure he'll do a great job.
And then what is one thing most people don't know about you?
Apart from my wool classing certificate, I have no formal qualifications.
Okay.
And it's not to say I wouldn't have liked to have finished my law degree or whatever, but I just didn't have that opportunity. So you can get there with a wool classing certificate.
This is probably an off-the-cuff question. Like, not having the qualifications, like, part of this podcast is talking about career journeys that, you obviously got to a very high level in your career. What challenges did that sort of pose to yourself in terms of not having any qualifications, if any?
Well, look, in those days, and we're going back sort of 30 years or so, I mean, it probably wasn't as essential as it is now. I mean, my 4 children, I'm happy to say they've all got tertiary qualifications, which, as we know, sometimes you can use them if you're a doctor or a dentist or something, but a lot of the time you end up doing something that's completely different to the degree you've got. I was always surprised how many, when I was doing executive search, how many of the really good managers around had science degrees, mathematics degrees, didn't have an MBA, didn't have a business degree. I think these days it's essential. I mean, to break into any sort of business position without a degree today is pretty much impossible.
So you mentioned earlier your career began as a farmer. You mentioned why you got into farming, but what did you learn as a farmer that helped you throughout your career?
Look, managing people, as you know, is absolutely essential if you're going to succeed in life. And my father always said to me, if you can manage a shearing shed, you can manage anything. Because, you get all types at a shearing shed. So I took that on board, and I think, I did learn a lot about people when I was farming, and that stood me in good stead when I went into politics and later into business.
What influenced you to go into politics as a member of Goulburn in the New South Wales Parliament. And how was that transition? Because I would imagine going from obviously farming into politics would have been a huge move. Run us through that.
I had to buy a couple of new suits to start with.
At least you can still probably keep the RMs.
All that. But yeah, look, obviously it was a transition. I'd been sitting on the local council for, I think, 5 or 6 years before I ran for the state parliament. So I had a bit of an idea how meetings went and how to persuade people to do things and so on. But it was really, exchanging the RMs and the blue jeans for a suit.
Yeah.
But it seemed to work quite well. I mean, I think the background that I'd had at school and so on, set me up for that. But it certainly was a transition, and it was a transition for my family as well. I mean, it's, I don't think anyone who's had anything to do with politics understands that it's very tough on your family life. I mean, there are many jobs that are as well, but politics is a 24/7 game. I mean, constituent rings you up at home at midnight on a Saturday night, you're unlikely to say bugger off.
Yeah.
So you have to talk to them and find out what they want and help them and so on. And, you have to be in touch with your constituents. So you're in Sydney in Parliament all week, and then you go home, particularly to a country electorate, and then you have to spend time, going to a debutante ball or a local show or whatever it is. So it's a very busy and engrossing occupation.
Yeah.
I loved it, but I certainly, I had my time there. I was in Parliament for nearly 12 years, a minister for nearly 7. By that stage, I was 45, and I thought I needed to get out and do something else.
Yeah. I've been lucky enough to know you for a number of years now, Bob, and you're one of the most lovely, down-to-earth humans I've come across and met. Time for a lot of people, and no doubt you get pulled in many different directions. Going from farming into politics, did you have to adapt your style, your personality? Like you've always struck me as a very down-to-earth, giving human being. But obviously it's a big transition to then go into the corporate world. In terms of your style and personality, has Bob always kept the same Bob? But have you had to change and evolve personalities over the years?
Yeah. Look, I suppose I have, but I mean, as I say, I've always taken my father's advice on board. I mean, respecting other people, regardless of who they are, is really important. And I think I've maintained that as a sort of a core value. Obviously, there's an awful lot to learn in politics, and when you so radically change a career. But on the other hand, farmers have traditionally made pretty good ministers and pretty good politicians because they have run their own business. Yeah. They have learned how to face adversity, and they know how to manage people. So if you can translate those skills from farming across to whatever sort of portfolio you have to look after or whatever, it's not a bad start.
Yeah.
And, whereas you'd expect, a lawyer who's been a partner in a law firm doing stuff should be able to make the transition well, but they don't often do that because they haven't been running a business. They haven't been managing, or they maybe managed the staff, but it's not the same.
Yeah. As a minister for the New South Wales Parliament for over 10 years, your ministerial portfolios included planning, housing and property services, family and community services, tourism and energy. To focus on the energy portfolio, what were the hot topics in that time in energy, and what is still relevant to the energy leaders of today?
We're talking now here the early 1990s. Bob Hawke was Prime Minister. Nick Greiner was Premier of New South Wales. Wayne Goss was the Labor Premier of Queensland. And Jeff Kennett was about to come in as Premier of Victoria. They were all keen reformists. I mean, I think a lot of people pull their hair out at the moment that governments are so lacking in the courage to reform. In those days, reform was a big thing. Yeah. So things like mutual recognition and so on of people's qualifications. So a plumber in Queensland wasn't a plumber in New South Wales until they brought in this mutual recognition law. An egg that was laid in Queensland wasn't legally an egg in New South Wales. So that sort of stuff was changing. They were big changes. And part of that change was the decision to have a national electricity market, and which was not easy to do because there was virtually no interconnection between the states.
Yeah.
So those interconnectors had to be built or upgraded so that, the surplus electricity from Queensland could come down into New South Wales, or Victoria into New South Wales, or vice versa. And that still never really happened to the fullest extent.
Yeah.
But it's a very important part of the market.
Yeah.
Because, so I was Energy Minister for only just a bit over a year, but it was interesting during that time, and that's when the corporatisation of the state-owned electricity businesses started to happen.
Yeah.
For example, everything, all the power stations, distribution infrastructure in New South Wales was all owned by the New South Wales Electricity Commission, by one huge sort of semi-government body.
Yeah.
And there are a number of attempts to reform it, but eventually, we ended up with 3 New South Wales-owned companies running the power generation, and one of those being Macquarie Generation, where I later became a director. And then eventually they were sold off to the private sector. So that was a big change.
Yeah.
And one of the things I did while I was Energy Minister was to complete what my predecessor as Minister had started, was the electrification of the West Darling. The West Darling being, if you look at a map of New South Wales, it's the far northwest corner of the state. So if you think of the state in 4 quarters, it's the one up on the left.
Okay.
Only about 500 people live in it. Basically desert, outback grazing country. Towns like Tibooburra and White Cliffs and so on. You hear about them on the weather at night, but that's about it. They didn't have mains electricity.
God.
They had generators and stuff. It was before solar panels really came to the fore.
Yeah.
So we put the power on out there, gave them a deal they couldn't really refuse to get it on, and it made hell of a difference. I remember one guy out there had 5 daughters, and he said the great thing about having the mains electricity was they could all run their hairdryers at once. So, but it did make a huge difference to people's quality of life, and of course, a lot of native Australians lived in there as well. So, it was something that I didn't initiate, but I was happy to finish it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that was it. So we had lots of discussion between ministers on this national electricity market and how it would work.
Yeah.
And and then I moved on then from planning and energy to planning and housing. And others carried that reform through. And then when the change of government occurred in 95, Michael Egan, the late Michael Egan, who was a good friend of mine, was the Treasurer and Energy Minister, and he did a lot of the further development of the markets and the commercialisation of the electricity entities. So it's been something that both sides of politics have done and seen the need for. And we've come a long way.
Yeah, certainly have. Very few people, Bob, have moved between energy ministry policy roles and into businesses that run the grid. And obviously you spent 8 years as chair of Endeavour. If you could go back in time, what is one thing that you would change or influence related to energy, knowing what you know now?
Good question. And I mean, I mentioned it before. I think the fact that there wasn't sufficient capacity in the interconnectors between all of the states have led to anomalies in the system, if you like. So, and that was, I suppose, in the end political, because we then went into a period where there was reform fatigue. So the premiers and prime ministers who followed those people I named before didn't have the same appetite for it. So it sort of slowed down. And as you know, the Snowy has always sort of sat more or less on the New South Wales Victorian border, and it was selling electricity both ways to Victoria and New South Wales, and that interconnector needed to be upgraded, the interconnector to South Australia. So those things have happened, but not necessarily as part of an overall plan.
Yeah.
That led to inefficiencies in the system.
What are your thoughts around nuclear? And looking back at the time, if you don't mind me asking, and if you're looking at early 90s, is that something we should have been looking at the time? And where does
well, we probably should have, but I mean, when you think back to the early 90s and the early 2000s, I mean, no one really talked about how bad coal was.
Yeah.
I mean, coal was plentiful. cheap,
Yeah.
and literally beside the power stations. So Macquarie Generation, which I sat on the board of for some years, Liddell and Bayswater were there on the highway.
Yeah.
And there was a mountain of coal next door. So all they had to do was to dig it up, put it on a conveyor belt, shove it into the crusher and blow it into the furnace, and that was it, the electricity. So it was very cheap.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think everyone thought it would go on forever. Then of course when we've had this revelation about carbon and climate change and so on, everything's changed. And burning coal has sort of become a bad thing to do. But to answer your question about nuclear, I mean, nuclear's been popular, then it became unpopular when you had those 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and so on accidents, the one in Japan, all of which were explained that it wasn't nuclear technology that caused those accidents, it was external factors. But then when you look at the French who've basically used nuclear power for the last 40 or 50 years, and they've done it really well, I think we need to have another look. Because, whilst I didn't set out to be controversial in this chat, the fact is that the Labor government, with their clean energy policies, whilst, there's a lot to be said for them, there's no way they're going to be able to achieve what they say they're going to achieve by 2030, 2035, 2040. And it's going to cost hell of a lot more. And you're still going to have the problem that you don't have sufficient safe baseload power unless you have coal or gas or nuclear. And that's when the nuclear thing will probably be revisited, because whilst it costs a lot and we'd have to start from scratch here in Australia, a nuclear power station lasts 100 years. They say the windmills will last about 25, solar and, a bit longer, but I think it will be revisited. And whilst, Peter Dutton has sort of been criticised heavily for what he said, and he's probably been a bit vague about how it's going to happen, I think when you look at nuclear, there's no carbon problem with nuclear at all. And when it's done well, and as I say, they talk about 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, but I mean, that's like comparing Stephenson's steam engine with the modern Jeep, XPT trains of today.
Come a long way.
So they've come a long way with nuclear. I say the French have led the way, but the Americans have got nuclear power stations. Canadians, Japanese, it's everywhere. The Swedes, so the technology's there, and I think they probably will have to revisit it, because if we're going to reduce the carbon significantly, it's going to require various different types of energy to do that. And nuclear's got to be part of it.
What do you think the Australian energy industry needs to get right, and what do we need to avoid to ensure a successful transition?
They're going to have to maintain a reliance on gas. I get the fact that the coal-fired power stations are wearing out anyway. Gas is going to be an important component of the sector for the next probably 30, 40, 50 years. And I was pleased to see Chris Bowen finally admit that recently. So they're going to have to build some more gas-fired stations, because you're going to need to have backup for the battery technology, which is developing and advancing, but you're going to have to still have backup for that, because if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine and things go wrong, how are we going to supply people's power? We're going to be 30 million, 35 million people in the next 20 years. And we need to have that certainty. Snowy 2.0 is great. They finally unbog the digging machines and get that working. But I think they're going to have to consider all of these options, and gas is going to have to be part of it until they can find a way to ensure power security, baseload power security.
I was at a energy conference a few weeks ago, All Energy, down there in Melbourne, and there was a lot of talk about organisations and developers working with country communities that they're working within. Some of them were getting the engagement right with their communities, and some others were getting it horribly wrong. As someone who was the Minister for Goulburn, and as someone who currently lives in the country, what do you think organisations / developers are doing to get the balance right in their communities, and what do they need to avoid, or where are they getting it wrong?
Well, from what I can gather, and this is not a a general observation. What I've seen, there's probably hasn't been enough consultation and information. Now, you're always going to get people who oppose anything, no matter how much information they're given and how many meetings are called. Electricity's own concept that's around now to try and put in place the infrastructure to take advantage of the green energy policy is a massive undertaking. And I know in my own, the Urana region, I think the cost of it's up around $6, $7, $8, $9, $10 billion. Lots of power lines going over private property, doubled up with the windmills, which have always been controversial, and the solar farms, which are also controversial. So you're asking very conservative farmers and country people to sort of embrace all this. Yeah. And it's not easy, and particularly when there's a need to speed up the process, not slow it down. Yeah. But I think if they don't slow it down and they don't take people into their confidence and so on, then there's going to be a lot of court cases and a lot of disruption. So I think that's the challenge, and it's a big challenge. Yeah. And as I say, I don't believe, and I think secretly the government doesn't believe they're going to meet these energy targets, these CO2 targets. Not going to be easy.
No, and one of the things that also came out of that conference is what we've got to do in terms of being able to hit those targets. Like just hearing around how many wind turbines need to be built in areas, I think it's sort of double the rate where we are at the moment. So, a huge amount of work to be getting done. Yeah,
no, I think that's right. They really do just have to slow down and try and take most of the people with them.
And I listen to my father-in-law who also lives in Goulburn, and he very passionately, we passionately have the debate around sort of transmission lines going through the country to support the city. And as a farmer himself, he is very strong in his opinion and his beliefs. But I think, as you said, it's a matter of taking the communities on a journey and give them as much information as possible.
And the cost of it is massive. So eventually that cost is going to be passed on to the consumer. So whilst we've got some electricity cost relief now, it's not going to be there forever. And that will then cause political opposition and so on. So as I say, going back to nuclear, it's hard to imagine anything happening with nuclear in the next 10 years. But as I say, energy, it's a long game.
Yeah. We hope you're enjoying this episode of Powering Your Career. To stay updated with our latest episodes, don't forget to click follow or subscribe. Leaving a review goes a long way in helping others discover this show. For more details on West Recruitment and how we can assist you, please visit us at westrecruitment.com.au. Diversity, equity and inclusion, Bob, is so important for the energy industry. And as someone, as you said, who was sort of in the energy and has been in the energy industry for a long time, in your role, both, I suppose, in government, but also your board roles, why is diversity, equity and inclusion so important in the businesses that you've been part of over the years? What benefits has it added to sort of the organisations you've been part of it? And how can diversity benefit the wider energy industry, in your view?
Well, I think diversity, if we're talking essentially about gender diversity, we had half the population shut out of a lot of areas before, where there was areas where women just didn't go. Now, that's all changed. I mean, when I first became chairman of Endeavour, we had a big intake of apprentices, 100 apprentices, 50 boys, 50 girls. Fantastic.
Yeah.
And the girls have lasted longer than the boys.
Yeah.
That's a big thing. I think there are plenty of areas where traditionally women didn't go. Yep. And now they're there and they're doing, they're performing so well. So I think that's, and we're all beneficiaries of the fact that they're part of the workforce. So that's happened, and it's happened in just about every area, including, say, those traditional areas where women did go, but also many areas where they don't, places like engineering, science, etc.
Yeah.
So that's happening. And we had some fabulous men and women at Endeavour.
Yeah.
And you know them well, and they're a Western Sydney business, and that whole population diversity that we talk about in Australia was so evident at Endeavour. Just about every nation on earth represented in the staff there, both men and women. Fantastic.
Yeah. So to go on to your board search and board career, Bob, so you spent 20 years in board search. What advice would you give to people wanting to develop a board career?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, people that have had senior executive roles, particularly in the in the listed company environment, always seem to have a bit of a walk-up start in terms of being considered for boards, because they understand the way listed companies work and so on. Equally, boards these days are getting more interested in looking at diversity in their director ranks. So rather than hiring all guys who've been CEOs or CFOs on listed companies, maybe they need some younger people. They need obviously more females and people that have had a greater breadth of experience doing other things. So that's opened up the field more for people from, if you like, a non-traditional background.
Yeah.
Some people have tried to get onto boards, I think, too young, and I think you need to make sure you've got an experience set which is going to add value to the company that you're aspiring to be on. And obviously, doing the directors course, I've encouraged all of the CEOs and senior people that I've been involved with to do that course, the Institute of Company Directors course. It's a very good course and it prepares you well. It's an evolving career choice, and it used to be a career choice. It was sort of something that people did after they had finished their work. And there are, say, younger people going on boards, which is a good thing.
Yeah. A few years ago, you did and shared your knowledge with a group of our clients out in Parramatta. And I think the other thing you sort of mentioned was potentially looking at non-for-profits as maybe your first sort of step into a career, and also probably giving yourself a few years to develop that career, because I think people go into it maybe looking for quick wins and thinking, okay, I'm going to get a board position easily. But I think through conversations that I've heard or feedback I've had, that it is a process. It does take a few years, and I think it's a stepping stone. And I think one of the pieces you said was not-for-profit to then develop that board resume. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's true. And a lot of people have, put themselves forward for a not-for-profit board, say a charity or something to do with cancer or and quite often the chairman of those boards are also chairs of listed companies, and if they see a young Dave Smith turn up from the board of the whatever it is charity, and they see the way you're operating, then that obviously gives you a great connection, and developing those networks is really important. But you also gain massive experience sitting on one of those boards, even though you're probably not being paid for it.
What's the most important thing a senior leader or CEO can do to build a strong, trusting relationship with a board, especially when faced with maybe a difficult or a high stress decision?
Need to be very well briefed. So, it goes without saying that people should read and understand their board papers. I've seen the board papers for some of the big banks, and they're literally, a foot high.
Yeah.
So how you digest all of that and make sense of it, I'm not sure. But you really do need to decide what elements of the business need attention and apply yourself diligently to that. Ask the right questions. And there's definitely a fine line between being too much into the weeds, as they say, but then not being enough into the weeds.
Yeah.
So people say, how can these boards have allowed something like this to happen? The money laundering in the banks, for example, was a big issue.
Yeah.
It's hard for a board, which is a part-time position, to know everything that's going on. So you really need to sort of focus on those key areas and become really well across them. And ask the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without being a pest.
Fine balance.
Fine
balance.
balance.
So, Bob, given your career, what's the best career advice that you've ever been given or you've ever heard?
Learn to listen. Understand the business. I mean, my youngest son is just starting out in his career. He finished his business degree last year. He's got a good job with one of the accounting firms.
Yep.
And I said to him, don't be a know-all, listen, get to know the business well, work hard, and treat people with respect.
Yep.
The rest will flow.
Yeah. And I think very, very wise words. What skills should people be developing in your mind to be successful in the energy industry?
Well, I think they really need to understand where technology is going.
Yeah.
I mean, and try and get ahead of that if you can, at least we'll keep up with it at best, because there is an awful lot happening.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about batteries technology, for example. I mean, that's going to be one of the things that probably might save the government and its promises to reducing carbon if they can get enough batteries out there that work well to really make the green energy policy a reality. So that's one area.
Yep.
Obviously, all the technology around delivering the green energy is also changing, and the infrastructure, making having a much more efficient infrastructure than what was there. And we saw the other day those power lines come down.
Yeah.
Massive. I mean,
They're Broken Hill.
Got to try and find a way to stop that from happening. And you can't underground them all. I mean, you'd like to, but it's like 10 times the cost or whatever. So when you look at the distances you've got to run things in Australia. So, but that getting ahead of the technology and the development's really important, because you know, I mean, we developed solar panels in Australia. We were at the
NSW, wasn't it? Yeah.
And I remember when I was Energy Minister announcing grants from the government to the University of New South Wales to keep going with these solar panels. And so, you know, we're not making them here, although the Prime Minister thinks we can. But maybe we should be.
So the energy industry is something that is moving at great pace. It's so important for sort of Australia's future. In your mind, why should people be looking at a career within the energy industry?
Well, I think it's a long game. So there's a lot going on, and there's going to be a lot going on. So there's opportunities there for young people, whether they're engineers or have a technology background or whatever, to join. It's an exciting time. And you know, I certainly felt with my period as chairman of Endeavour, I just saw massive transition, because it was, you know, a government-owned utility, which majority of it was sold to Endeavour, changed their name from the old Integral Energy, and it became a very dynamic organisation. And you know, your company has been responsible for finding some very good people for Endeavour, Dave. So, but no, I think a great industry to get involved in. It's certainly not static. There's lots going on.
No, and I was going to say, sitting or looking at where the energy industry now will be very different in 12 months to 24 months to 5 years.
And particularly, as I say, if they can find a way to speed up the implementation of nuclear and the battery technology, they're two of the really important developments that, and of course, you know, what they're doing with hydrogen, which is, you know, complicated. But all of those things could have a major influence on the industry going forward.
Absolutely. So last but certainly not least is just to have a chat around mental health and wellness. Generally, Bob. So something I'm really passionate about, and keen to sort of have people discussing sort of on this podcast. How have you seen the change in organisations, in people within the organisations you've been part of, in their view of mental health and wellness in the workplace?
Well, I think the big thing that's occurred over the last 30 years or so is the development of HR as a serious function within most organisations. I mean, you know, they used to be personnel managers or whatever the saying was. It wasn't. They didn't sit in the direct reporting line to the CEO like they do today. So you've now got a really fine, well qualified group of HR people out there who can recognise the problems that are inherent in the whole mental health area, and you know, it's a high pressure world we live in. Social media is getting a bad rap at the moment, maybe too much so, but maybe deservedly. certainly with young people. It seems to be having a negative effect on many young people. People are bullied using social media. Their self-esteem is lowered. So I think being able to recognise that within a company environment is probably the role of HR, but it has to be embraced by the leaders. And I think that's happening, and people's behaviour has to improve. I mean, we've had many successful leaders. Some of them are nice people, some of them aren't. And they've bullied people, and and people have left crushed. Some of them have committed suicide. These things all need to be continually addressed because it is, as we know, a high pressure world.
Yeah.
And so I think we're doing well. We need to do better.
Yeah.
My great friend John Brogden has done a marvellous job in making people aware of the dangers of mental illness and potential suicide and so on. I think we're doing well in that department. We can always do more.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is governments probably haven't spent enough on mental health. So, we had a situation going back to my early time in politics where if people had a mental illness or whatever, they just locked them up in these awful old institutions. And we had one in Goulburn with a padded cell and all the rest of it. Pretty awful. The quality of the drugs and so on improved, and people were able to be rehabilitated into the community, sometimes in a group homes or going back to their own. But someone has to make sure that they are looked after, that they're taking their medication, that if they're having a relapse, someone's across it. And there's probably not enough money spent on that now, even though you hear of millions and millions being spent. They say the jails are half full of people with mental illness, and they shouldn't be in jail. So these are things that need to be continually looked at. And it's expensive. And when you see the number of old people out there like me, it's going to be up to the younger generation to pay for their medical care, and I don't know where the money's going to come from, to be honest.
I wouldn't imagine sort of mental health or wellness were sort of discussed in those shearing sheds back when you were managing them back in the day.
No, there's some pretty good drinkers there, though.
I bet there would have been.
They used to drown their sorrows at the pub.
Yeah. And what about yourself? And probably a more personal question, like for your mental health and wellness, is there anything that you do specifically, Bob, to make sure you're okay?
Yeah, I mean, I've never been someone who's overly stressed. I think at one stage when I had a few sort of difficult things happening in my political career, I started to grind my teeth, and I no longer do that. No, I think exercise is great. I mean, I've got a crooked leg, so it gets harder to walk and so on. But I think exercise is really important. I go to the gym as often as I can, and that sort of thing. And I think exercising your brain as well as you get older, doing things like the crossword and the quiz and reading and so on, keeps the brain active. But no, I've always been fortunate. I've always had a fairly sunny disposition. So.
No, well, Bob, thank you so much for being part of the podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure having this discussion with you. So thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge and experience. If you've enjoyed this podcast, if you can please share it with your network or recommend it to other people, that'd be much appreciated. But Bob, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Dave.
See ya. Thanks for listening to this episode of Powering Your Career with David Smith. Join me next time as we talk to energy leaders to provide you valuable perspectives on career development, leadership, navigating the energy transition, and strategies for managing mental health and wellness in a high-pressure industry. If you are enjoying this series, please click follow or subscribe for further episodes. And leaving a review or a comment helps others find this podcast. Also, if our team can assist you with any recruitment requirements or you are keen to discuss your career journey, please reach out to West Energy or West Recruitment at westrecruitment.com.au. Thanks.